All of the pressures we've discussed, nationalism, political frustration, social unrest, industrial tension, and famine, finally exploded in 1848. The spark, as so often in modern European history, came from France, and more specifically from Paris, the old capital of revolution. France had already experienced a revolution in 1830, which removed Charles X from power and replaced him with his cousin, Louis Philippe. Known as the middle-class monarch, Louis Philippe attempted to present himself as an ordinary citizen by dressing modestly and even walking to work carrying an umbrella. Despite these efforts, he faced growing opposition from many different groups. Some French citizens wanted to establish a republic similar to the one created in 1792, while others favoured keeping a monarch but limiting the position to a largely ceremonial role. Still others longed for the return of a leader like Napoleon Bonaparte, and many began supporting Louis Napoleon, Bonaparte's nephew, whose popularity was steadily increasing. As political dissatisfaction combined with the economic hardship and social misery of the 1840s, France found itself in an increasingly unstable and explosive situation. In February 1848, Louis Philippe's government banned a large anti-government rally planned in Paris, but the crowds gathered in the streets anyway. On a bright February day, tensions quickly escalated as troops were called in to restore order. When shots were fired, though no one knew exactly who fired first, the situation spiraled out of control. Protesters erected barricades throughout the city, and Paris once again became the center of revolution. Within just a few days, the uprising forced Louis Philippe to abdicate and flee the country, bringing an end to his monarchy. The revolution in Paris quickly inspired a wave of uprisings across Europe. News of Louis Philippe's overthrow encouraged liberals, nationalists, and reformers in other countries to challenge existing governments and demand political change. Revolutions soon broke out in major cities such as Vienna and Berlin in March 1848, as well as in Rome and numerous cities throughout the German and Italian states. Across the continent, people called for constitutional government, expanded political rights, national unity, and social reforms. This widespread eruption of revolutionary activity became known as the springtime of peoples, reflecting the hopes of many Europeans that a new era of freedom and self-determination was beginning. Although the revolutions of 1848 were shaped by local issues and national circumstances, they shared many of the same political goals. Across Europe, revolutionaries demanded broader participation in government and sought to expand suffrage so that more people could vote and have a voice in public affairs. They also called for freedoms that liberals considered essential to a constitutional society, including freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and the legal right to form political parties. These demands reflected a desire to limit arbitrary government power and increase political representation. In many ways, the revolutionaries believed they were continuing the work begun by the French Revolution, striving to achieve the political liberties and democratic reforms that had been promised but never fully realized. As the revolutions spread, political demands quickly expanded into social and economic ones. Many factory workers called for job protection, shorter working hours, and higher wages to improve their difficult living and working conditions. Skilled craftsmen, threatened by the growth of industrial production and factory competition, sought measures to protect their trades and livelihoods. Peasants, meanwhile, pressed for relief from heavy debts, high rents, and the remnants of feudal obligations that still burdened rural life in many parts of Europe. These social and economic grievances broadened the revolution's appeal, drawing support from a wide range of groups whose hopes for a better life extended beyond political reform alone. As the revolutions progressed, a growing divide emerged within the revolutionary movement. Middle-class liberals generally focused on political reforms, such as constitutional government, individual rights, and free-market economic policies. They wanted greater political participation and limits on the power of traditional monarchies, but often remained committed to protecting private property and maintaining social order. In contrast, working-class radicals were more concerned with social and economic issues. They demanded labor protections, government assistance for the poor, better wages, and reforms that would address the hardships created by industrialization. Although these two groups initially cooperated in their opposition to existing regimes, their differing priorities and interests soon created tensions that weakened the revolutionary coalitions and contributed to their eventual collapse. By the summer of 1848, many of Europe's revolutions had begun to shift from primarily liberal movements focused on constitutional reform and political rights to movements increasingly concerned with social and economic change. As workers and radicals pushed for labor protections, economic assistance, and broader social reforms, the revolutions started to appear more socialist than liberal. This development alarmed many middle-class liberals who supported political liberties and constitutional government, but opposed sweeping economic transformation and threats to private property. By the autumn of 1848, fear of radical social change led many members of the middle class to abandon their revolutionary allies and instead join forces with monarchs, aristocrats, and the military. United by a desire to restore order and stability, these groups worked together to suppress the revolutions and dismantle the revolutionary coalitions that had briefly challenged the established political order. To understand how this process unfolded, it is helpful to examine the major regions affected by the revolutions of 1848. France held national elections following the Revolution of 1848, and the results surprised many observers. The winner was Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, the nephew of the famous Napoleon Bonaparte, whose name and family legacy made him enormously popular with voters seeking stability and strong leadership. Elected president of the new French Republic, Louis Napoleon gradually consolidated his power. In 1852, he followed the example of his uncle by dissolving the legislature, ending the Republic, and proclaiming himself Emperor Napoleon III. With this move, he established the Second Empire, marking the return of imperial rule to France and bringing an end to the revolutionary experiment that had begun in 1848. After suppressing the revolutionary uprisings of 1848, the Habsburg monarchy gradually reasserted its authority across the Austrian Empire. Although the government restored much of its political control, it also recognized the need for certain reforms in order to reduce unrest. The Habsburgs promised a new constitution and implemented some limited liberal reforms, while also addressing one of the most important demands of the rural population. They abolished the remaining feudal obligations that still burdened many peasants, effectively freeing them from traditional labor duties and payments owed to landlords. This measure proved to be the most popular achievement associated with the Viennese revolutionaries, helping to improve conditions for millions of peasants and reducing support for further revolutionary activity in the countryside. The Prussian royal family also succeeded in suppressing the revolution of 1848, using military force and political maneuvering to regain control. However, like the Habsburgs in Austria, the Prussian government recognized that some concessions were necessary to reduce popular unrest and maintain stability. As a result, the monarchy made limited promises of reform, including constitutional changes and greater political participation, in an effort to appease liberal critics and calm the population. While these reforms fell far short of the revolutionaries' original goals, they helped the Prussian monarchy preserve its authority and prevent further revolutionary upheaval. Nationalist uprisings proved even more complex than the political revolutions of 1848 because they involved questions of national identity, language, and statehood, in addition to demands for constitutional reform. In the German states, liberals and nationalists sought to unite the many independent German territories into a single nation. To achieve this goal, representatives from across the German-speaking world gathered in the city of Frankfurt in March 1848 to form the Frankfurt Parliament, the first attempt to create a unified German National Assembly. Delegates from numerous German states participated, and even Austria and Prussia sent representatives. While revolutions and social unrest continued in many German cities, the Frankfurt Parliament worked to draft a constitution for a united Germany that would guarantee liberal rights and establish a constitutional government. However, by 1849, the revolutionary momentum had faded, and the traditional monarchies had regained much of their power. When the Parliament presented its proposals, the major rulers, especially those of Austria and Prussia, refused to accept them. Lacking military force and political authority, the Frankfurt Parliament collapsed, and its vision of a unified liberal Germany was postponed for another generation. The Frankfurt Parliament concluded that any future German nation should include Prussia, whose population was overwhelmingly German-speaking, but exclude Austria, whose vast empire was home to many non-German peoples, including Hungarians, Czechs, Italians, Croats, and others. This proposal became known as the Small Germany, Kleindeutschland solution, envisioning a unified Germany led by Prussia rather than Austria. The issue of whether Austria should be included in a German nation would remain a central question in German politics, and would later play a decisive role in the successful unification of Germany under Prussian leadership. Despite the Parliament's efforts to create a constitution and establish a liberal, united German state, it lacked the power to enforce its decisions. As conservative governments regained control across Europe, the rulers of the German states ignored its proposals. The Frankfurt Parliament ultimately dissolved in March 1849, bringing an end to the first major attempt to unite Germany through liberal and democratic means. Across Europe, nationalist movements surged alongside the revolutions of 1848, but most ultimately failed to achieve their immediate goals. In Italy, nationalists and reformers hoped to unite the peninsula and free it from Austrian influence, leading several Italian states to wage war against Austria. Despite their efforts, Austrian military victories crushed the movement and preserved Habsburg dominance in northern Italy. In Hungary, revolutionaries sought independence from the Habsburg Empire and initially achieved significant successes, but the rebellion was eventually defeated with military assistance from Russia. Elsewhere, Slav nationalists meeting in Prague called for greater unity and recognition of their national aspirations, but their demands were largely ignored by imperial authorities. The Poles also launched uprisings in pursuit of national independence, only to see them suppressed by the powers that controlled Polish territory. Although these nationalist revolts ended in defeat, they kept alive the ideals of national self-determination and unity. Over the following decades, these aspirations would continue to inspire political movements, eventually contributing to the successful unification of both Italy and Germany later in the 19th century. Although the revolutions of 1848 largely failed in the short term, they revealed several important truths about the nature of modern politics and society. First, they demonstrated that revolution had become a permanent feature of Western civilization. The widespread uprisings showed that populations were increasingly willing to challenge established governments, and similar revolutionary movements would continue to emerge throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Second, the events of 1848 underscored the danger facing governments that refused to adapt to changing conditions. When political leaders ignored demands for reform or failed to address economic and social problems, popular frustration could erupt into revolution, sometimes with violent consequences. Finally, the revolutions showed that the forces of political participation and nationalism could not be permanently suppressed. Although the revolutionaries did not achieve their goals in 1848, the demands for constitutional government, broader political rights, and national unification continued to gain strength.